Mr. Ethan Calhoun, it seems like only yesterday you and I were sitting in middle school together. I had a bad haircut. I was a little weird. Now we're all grown up. You got a bow tie. I got a bad haircut. You are the assistant planning director at the Northwest Georgia Regional Commission. Tell us, what does that mean?
Thank you, Corey. Well, basically, in a nutshell, what that means is I work for the Regional Commission and management to manage our staff and our planning staff and community and economic development. And what we do is we take state and federal money to operate our organization, and we work with cities and counties across Northwest Georgia to promote community development and planning in order to do several things. And one of those most important things is to make sure that all governments in Northwest Georgia are what you call qualified local governments. And in other words, if a city or county is not a qualified local government, considered by the state of Georgia to be a qualified local government, then that city or county is not eligible for any state funding or permits or federal state funding or permits. And while some people would say, well, we're not interested in necessarily applying for grant money, that's not that big of a deal. It goes all the way to the degree that a city couldn't even get a radar gun permit to do speed traps if they're not qualified local governments.
Oh, no speed traps, darn.
So yeah, probably a bad comparison, but that's it affects a lot of things, and it's an important thing for them to be considered that. That's one of our baseline responsibilities, and we go through this process with every government every 5 years where we create comprehensive plans. It's one of our most steady responsibilities. And like I say, it's every 5 years we're required to go through that process with every single government in our region, which is 15 counties and 49 cities. And so that keeps us in the field, in the communities. And 5 years sounds like, it seems like a reasonable amount of time, but it goes by, immediately, and we're back in that community again. And of course, we're there intermittently too as needed, because we do grant writing, we do grant assistance to help identify funding, we help write grants for funding for cities and counties, but we are entirely a governmental organization. So we're funded through state funds, federal funds, and local dues. And
so I got to ask before you go any further, are there any unqualified cities in our area, and where can I go speeding without the radar gun?
Excellent question.
Yeah, very good question. No, actually, all of our communities in Northwest Georgia, we've managed to get them to that point that every community is a qualified local
If
government.
you're going to speed, you got to go to South Georgia.
That's right, yeah. Or Alabama.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, that's funny.
But that's essentially, in a nutshell, what we do. So we're not just planning and development, we're economic development related. So we try to do things that are promoting, job development, industrial development, and we look into grants and opportunities there to improve those things. So infrastructure to, things like water and sewer, and just, anything that can help promote economic development. And that can be industry, retail, or one of the more popular over in Northeast Georgia is tourism, obviously in the mountains. It's a major economic driver for them. So here in Dalton, we think of economic development mainly as big buildings and industry. And over in the more eastern side of our region, it's tourism. It's capturing those tourism dollars. So, we work on a lot of strategic plans and things like that to figure out, based on where you're at in the region, what your economies need or what they flourish on, and how to make sure that we're, improving that or embellishing that.
That's an interesting thing you bring up. When I didn't think about the planning commission being involved in tourism. That is not natural to me, I guess, because I grew up in Dalton and I think industry and I think development and how do we do that. One of the things I've noticed about that 515 corridor is that Blue Ridge is a ghost town Monday through Thursday. Like, you go to downtown Blue Ridge and there's one coffee shop open on Wednesday. But if you go on Saturday afternoon, there's, 1,000 people walking down that street. So LJ seems to be more populated during the middle of the week, and like every store is open. They're selling crafts and antiques. Mm-hmm. But people from Atlanta or outside of our area think of Blue Ridge as the Mecca. And so I guess maybe that's from a weekend environment. They just come up to the cabins on the weekends and they see it all at that time. What does the Planning Commission do in those scenarios? Is there a push to help Blue Ridge realize that, hey, there probably is some economics that are happening during the week? Or do y'all just kind of agree and stay out of it? I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
Right. And, from our perspective with the regional commission and being involved in that type of planning, it's interesting. Every one of those communities is unique. It's sort of like, different industrial towns are unique. It's all industrial development, but there's, more mechanized industrial development and there's more classical industrial development. And the same thing in tourism. There is your economies that are based solely on tourism that focus on certain times of the year, seasonal tourism, like think of the coast, for instance, obviously is a seasonal tourism, and much of the mountains are seasonal tourism. You've got a lot of folks that come in the fall. I mean, that's their biggest time of year. I mean, that's when they have the Apple Festival, and that's when they get probably the most peak amount of people. And then various times throughout the rest of the year, you're right, it's a weekender type thing. A lot of people come from Atlanta, a lot of people come from Chattanooga, and you've got the snowbirds that come down from up north. So it depends on the community. And what we do as a planning agency is we don't come to cities or counties and say, hey, we've been crunching numbers and we've been in our offices coming up with plans and ideas, and this is what you need to do. We come to them and kind of just start asking, the questions of, what is your economy based off of? What kind of needs do you guys see in your community on the ground? And what kind of opportunities do you think y'all have? And, would you like to pursue any of those? And then we start to try to come up with ways to help them do that. And that's kind of why our organization was developed back in the 60s, because that was a massive growth period in our region everywhere, and primarily along your 41 corridor. And you had this just boom of industry, housing boom at that time. And so our agency kind of came about to get out in front of some things. The interstate was really expanding during those years, and that was changing. That was going to change the dynamic of a lot of our communities. And so they were sort of overwhelmed by that, because this was just, all our region was a very rural place back then. And so there weren't staff planners and staff people that were, college educated planners, economic development people. And so they knew that they needed some type of talent agency or group to come, or specialized agency to pool together and look at some of these issues that were truly regional. They weren't just endemic to one community. And that's how the Regional Commission, in a nutshell, came about those decades ago. And so again, we're based very much in local government. While we get all that funding from the state, vast majority from the state and federal government, we have to follow the state and federal laws and regulations. But from a functional standpoint, we are basically like an extension of staff. We're like a planning department for cities that don't have a planning department, or that do have a planning department but need a little extra help because they're, say for instance, in some of our more busier communities, they may have a planning department, but they may be inundated with permits and day-to-day practice, and they don't have time to necessarily sit down and talk about long-range planning and start to put together the puzzle pieces of what's happening, how their community's developing, what they need to get out in front of or be cautious of, and how they may need to expand in infrastructure and things like that to make sure that they're sustainable in their growth in community. And that's one of our principal goals, obviously, is sustainability in the region, because you don't want to have that false sense of growth and economic vitality that then comes crashing down at the first sign of an economic issue. So diversification is key, but that's how we kind of came about, and that's sort of how we operate as an extension of every local government. And we do that, that's all by request. So when they need us, they call us, and we come meet and talk about whatever issues or opportunities that they're interested in pursuing. And then we come up with a strategy to either involve other agencies for funding or other agencies for strategic planning that can make sure that we get them the people or the resources that they need to, address those issues or capitalize on those kind of opportunities. So in the mountains, it just depends on which community you're in as to how the economy is based. And Ellijay, Blue Ridge has definitely grown faster than Ellijay. They've gotten a lot more investment over the years in their commercial tourism right there in downtown Blue Ridge. But Ellijay is on a very fast trajectory to increase their commercial downtown, if you will. And they're getting a lot of new investment and some very cool and unique developments for retail, restaurants, things like that are in the pipeline. And some already finished. I mean, they have a rooftop bar that's really cool. I don't know if you guys have been there. It's a restaurant too. It's not just a bar, but
I had sausage and sauerkraut there about 2 weeks ago.
yeah.
Was it cool?
Oh yeah, love the place. I mean, it's a rooftop, so you go up 3 flights of stairs. They have an elevator, but because I knew I was about to eat some sausage, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take the stairs. So went up 3 flights of stairs, took a breather to, tell the lady, oh, I just need a seat for one. And then you go sit at it's really like a bar, but it's facing the mountain. And so like you sit there and you just got this amazing mountain view right in front of you. And it's right downtown. It's awesome. I loved it. Cool. I thought it was a really cool environment, real trendy. And Corey's got a list of questions, so he's probably going to get mad at me in a minute and tell me to shut up. But like as you keep talking, I keep thinking of things. So Ellijay just passed, or maybe they didn't pass, but they certainly had a commotion about short-term rentals in the city of Ellijay recently.
Uh-huh.
I own a cabin in Gilmer County, and so I've got a short-term rental in Gilmer. So I saw the headline as I was walking by a newspaper stand. I'm like, whoa, let me see this a minute. So then I read it, and I realized it was just in the city, which is the city of Ellijay is not that big, really.
Right.
As far as footprint goes, yeah. So what are your thoughts on what's going on over there with short-term rentals and how that extrapolates throughout our 15-county area here?
Well, that's a great question. You brought up one of our good sticking points there. So
feel free to decline the answer if you need to.
One of the other things that I do is I serve on the board of directors with the Georgia Association of Zoning Administrators. And what we do is we organize and facilitate training for zoning administrators and planners and people that do that kind of work across the state to make sure they can continue education, and so that other people around the state, much like I was talking about in the regional commission about, being able to inform and being aware of trends that are happening that may be not in your back door yet, but maybe coming in your direction. We do that at the state level to make sure that everybody's aware of what's going on, and we provide those training opportunities. And one of the hottest topics that we've had in, I don't know, the last probably 5 years that is just reoccurring. Every time we do a survey and send out to our membership and say, hey, we're going to have a conference in 6 months. We're looking for speakers. What kind of topics do y'all want to hear about? Tiny houses and short-term rentals.
Oh, I was going there in a minute, but go ahead.
are always on there. But then, we've done so many sessions on that. We'll also get feedback that says, we've heard enough on short-term rentals and tiny houses. We want to
Can't make everybody happy.
We want to talk about other things. But no, it's still relevant. No matter how much we talk about it, there's still a lot of questions out there. It's still young enough that the long-term impacts, for better or worse in either one of those subjects, are not out there yet. I mean, this is still fairly a new idea in our modern development mentality. So to get to your question on short-term rentals, I don't want to dodge your question. It's a good question, and I think it's something that we need to talk about because it is something that has really affected a lot of communities that are destination-oriented, tourism especially. And, whether you're on the coast or you're in the mountains, obviously those are the two probably most popular places, unless you have a house in Augusta and once a week of the year you get to rent it for $30,000. Everywhere else relies on that tourism. And because your mountains have a steady tourism and your oceans have a steady tourism, or beachfronts, what that does, obviously it creates an opportunity, a big opportunity for people to buy that vacation house that they've always wanted and turn that into a self-sustaining source of income and a self-sustaining mechanism altogether. So it's sort of a hobby that pays for itself or something like that. So you have that asset, but it's not just a drain on your bottom line. So that's opened up that opportunity for, I think, a lot of people to do that. And I think it's a good thing. And it's obviously it put a lot of pressure and competition on your classic hotel, motel, hospitality industry in that now you have a different option. You don't just have to stay in a hotel. You can rent a whole house, you can rent a cabin, or something like that. And it's created a lot of more tourism opportunity in our region, in the mountain areas. Because of that, people can come now and rent houses, things like that, stay for a whole week and enjoy themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's been a huge asset. But from a land use standpoint, we had to start looking at it, because what happens is that specifically and particularly in the mountain communities, a lot of our mountain communities have become retirement communities. Mm-hmm. And if you'll notice, most of our mountain communities have passed senior tax exemptions. So it's become a very attractive destination for retirees from all over the place, not just the state. You know, Atlanta's probably the biggest contributor to that, Chattanooga, but I mean, there's people from all over the country that move to Ellijay or Gilmer County or Fannin County and buy a cabin or build a house.
We get calls from folks everywhere for that.
Yes, to your point, my neighbor at my cabin, Ellijay, came from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Like, retired to Ellijay in the middle of nowhere.
Well, and it's this great, when you think about it on a national level and you think, well, where do I want to go? You know, one of the things that you think about, I mean, obviously you're like, well, mountains, and you think the Rocky Mountains and things out there, but 8 feet of snow is not all the time. And like a 4-month summer is not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. And also being 80 miles away from a Kroger is not also attractive.
I'd like to go to the grocery store without the helicopter.
Yeah. If you're Harrison Ford, it's not that big a deal. You just fly your plane over there. But in Ellijay and Gilmer County, since I guess probably the last 25 years, they've had a lot of amenities like grocery chains, stores, some great restaurants. Mm-hmm. And so, you can live in the mountains in Ellijay and be, quote unquote, in the middle of nowhere, but within no further than a half an hour of all the stores and all the restaurants that, you need to get by. Medical care, absolutely. And right on the main thoroughfare to go to Atlanta within, an hour and a half or two and, have anything you could possibly want. So that it's a big draw in that way from the national level. But my point that I wanted to make with this short-term rental is that you have people who build their dream house or their retirement home where they want to live out the rest of their days, per se, quote unquote. And that's where they want to live as a full-time residence. And what happens sometimes with short-term rentals, and not all the time, it's all a matter of management, just like anything. You got different neighbors every week, people parking and things like that. You get noise issues and stuff like that can change from week to week, and it creates a certain, concern for those neighbors who live there full time and have to deal with that sometimes. And then where it becomes an issue is not when you have a house or two in a community, but where you start to see the trend that no longer do you have day-to-day true residents, full-time residents, that a large portion of your housing has now gone to short-term rentals because it's profitable, and a lot of people are buying investment properties and scooped up a lot of housing, and so now it's not necessarily full-time housing, it's short-term rentals, and that affects a lot of things. One of the biggest things that it's affected in the mountain region is it's really affected affordable housing, because the tourism industry is a big industry and contributes a ton to the local economy. However, one of the issues is the majority of people that work in the tourism industry are not ultra high paying jobs. They're service jobs. They're waiters, cooks, tour guides, groundskeepers. And you can go on down the list of all the people that work for a lot of these tourism type jobs. Mm-hmm. And so in order to grow that industry and keep a steady supply of talent that will staff that particular or those particular jobs, you need to have some housing that they can afford. And while at a point in time, housing was very affordable in the mountains, it's not necessarily that way anymore, because you're outcompeted by a large group of people who may not even be buying a house there now to even use as their vacation home, like I mentioned earlier. You just have people who just want to invest in property and, remodel a house and put it up on Airbnb or VRBO and turn it into an income source. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it just has this inverse impact on the housing market, and obviously the like I mentioned, the folks that work in the tourism industry, and it's created some issues there.
Man, that brings up two really good things that I want to touch on. The
affordable housing.
The affordable
Got to talk
housing,
about that one.
That's coming for sure. The other thing that I want to kind of hit on, and I think we might have it on the list, but I'll go ahead and say it now. First of all, I'll back up and say I'm an investor. So I'm all about the short-term rentals. It is profitable, like you said. Like, there's a lot of reasons to do it, so I'm all about it. At the same time, totally understand the perspective of we got to have some moderation, and we've talked about this in other episodes and just in one-on-one conversations Corey and I have had. It seems like there's very much a divisiveness. Either it's free market capitalism and libertarian all the way, and it's my property rights, and you can't take away my property rights, or it's complete the other way, total bureaucracy, total just do overkill on all the rules and regulations. And so, finding that balance seems to be the hard thing, is keeping that pendulum from swinging too far. And so I feel like every day you come to work with 2 coffee cups, and one of them's like tighter regulation, looser regulation. It's like, which one am I drinking out of today? I don't envy your seat is what I'm getting at there. But how do you manage? You have the right to use your property however you like, while also not affecting the other person's, a real estate term is quiet enjoyment. Like, that is a term that we often use. Like, you can't affect their quiet enjoyment. How do you balance that?
That's a great question. It's going to take a minute.
I told Corey we're going 2 hours today. So.
Yeah.
Fire away.
So, to go back in time, back to, how zoning and regulation, land use regulation came about in our country, you go back to the 1920s. And that was a huge growth, the boom, obviously 100 years ago, one of the largest economic expansions in our economy in history. And, it had a lot of the things that we have today. There were new things happening, new technologies, new types of development that this country had never seen before. And with that comes great opportunity and prosper, but also comes the growth pain of the people who are affected by things in a negative way, one way or another. And so back at that time, there was this issue in a Supreme Court case. It went to the National Supreme Court, and it was the Euclid versus Ambler case. You can go back and read about that, but basically it was this issue where you had a sort of a development that wanted to impact a town, and it was going to create this massive issue and really destroy a lot of quality of life and a lot of property values that were in that community because of this use. I can't remember if it was a quarrying operation or if it was a large industrial operation, but nevertheless, it was going to create this massive issue. And in that court case, it was upheld that local government decided that development was not in the best interest of the community long term, for the negative impact far outweighed the positive impact that it would have on that community, even on an economic level. Mm-hmm. And so they denied them that ability to build that development or to develop their property. And so that started the trend of now other people, everybody's always paying attention to these things when Supreme Court cases happen, because now all your other communities that are facing a lot of the same issues now understand, well, the Supreme Court upheld this decision. So this means that we do have some basis to say, to place some sort of regulation on things if we believe that the cost benefit analysis to our community is going to be in the negative. Then we can step in as local government and say, this is not the development for our community because it is not going to be overall beneficial. And so that started back at the national level, and that, of course, went through many iterations over the years. And in Georgia, zoning is actually a part of our Constitution in the state of Georgia. So every local government, city and county in the state of Georgia has a constitutional right granted by the state to practice zoning. and to zone property. And that's not something that every state in the union has. And so that's a very big strength in Georgia. And it's kind of tied to the old home rule, if you're familiar with that, that it's not the state's job to get involved in the day-to-day operation of local government. That's the local government's decision and how they want to plan their community and how they want to zone their community. The only thing that the state government and the federal government affect or get involved in is the procedure and how you carry that out. Mm-hmm. So they want to know, was there a rational, they call it a rational nexus. In other words, was there a reason that's a reasonable approach taken to determine the regulation that you've imposed versus the impact that was expected, for better or worse, for the development? Or was the regulation imposed far in and above any reasonable any reasonable reaction to that? And so when we analyze property to rezone, to approve or deny, of course, I don't actually rezone or approve or deny anything. I just write recommendations and analyze things and write reports and give that to either the local government or their planning commissions or some other body to just look at that information and use that as part of their decision-making process. But what we do is governed by procedure, and that procedure in Georgia is called the Georgia Zoning Procedures Act. They call it the ZP, or Zoning Procedures Law, ZPL. And you can look that up in the official Georgia code, and it's OCGA 36-66, and you can read on that. It's not really long, and it's actually very concise. Mm-hmm. And so when you go there and read it, it doesn't say a lot, but it does leave a lot to be desired as far as specifics, because it leaves a lot into what you might call subjective opinion. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it difficult. So we have to look and analyze all these properties and requests with the same exact procedure and the same exact standards. You can't look at properties and use different standards and different procedures. That's what they call arbitrary, which means that's like the old good old boy system of, John Smith's a good guy. He does good development. We're going to let him build apartments, but this other guy, we don't know him, so we're not going to approve him. That you can't do that anymore. I mean, if you do, well, you can, but you're going to get a really fun day in court when the judge gets a hold of you. So that's why you have these standards and these procedures that we go by, and we do the same process for everybody. It kind of tries to remove all that personal element and really look at it more from a more analytical state. And so, those procedures are usually they're called Gould factors, and there's a list in the zoning procedures law of baseline factors, and then a community can have more standards if they want to adopt them. But again, they just have to make sure that every single action that they look at, they follow those same procedures and they use the same standards to measure whether it's a benefit or not to approve or deny a zoning. And those standards are usually very simple, basic standards, like first and foremost, is the existing zoning in the area reflective of what's being requested? In other words, if say somebody's asking to zone their property commercial, or let's say high density residential for apartments, and you look at the area and you look at their zoning map and you say, well, either there is some adjacent property in the area nearby that is zoned for this type of land use, meaning that this character could already exist or already does exist in the area. And would this zone, if it's placed in that question, create an island or a spot zone, they call it, where you have this anomaly in the middle of an area? Like, obviously you wouldn't build an apartment complex in the middle of, let's say, the farm or something like that, where you've got large lot, large houses, because it'd be totally out of character. Mm-hmm. So we look at the zoning and we look at the built environments, like I just said when I made that analogy. We look at the built environment, what exists here, because what it may be zoned may not be what it's used for. That's a whole other issue. But we look at the built environment, we look at the zoning, we look at what type of impact this could have from an economic standpoint on property, for better or worse. We look at infrastructure. In other words, can the roads support the type of development that we're looking at? Can the water and sewer utility support this kind of growth or development? Is it sustainable long term? That's the more difficult question to ask overall. with development, with being sustainable. And one of the other questions is, does it fit the comprehensive plan? So that plan I talked about earlier that we work with every 5 years, one of the required elements of that is to have a future development map or a future land use map. And that's exactly what it sounds like. They draw a map out and you look at where it makes sense to have different types of development. So residential, various densities of residential, where it makes sense to have those developments, commercial, industrial, agricultural, so on and so forth, and where you want to preserve land, natural land, obviously parks and recreation, things like that. And you lay all that out in this map, and you define areas as to how they should develop over time. And that's determined a lot by, again, infrastructure, because that's the very sticky point with development, is creating, as I mentioned earlier, sustainable development, and making sure that the development that's being proposed is going to be a benefit to the community long term, rather than create a drain on the community. Because when you have to extend costly infrastructure for many miles, that return on investment is very difficult to recoup back on utilities without eventually having to charge the taxpayer a big increase years down the road when that infrastructure is aging. I think we all know today what aging infrastructure, what that's like and how costly that is to fix. So better planning to make sure that we don't do some of those things and sprawl our development per se to an unsustainable point. Those are all part of what you look at in a rezoning to figure out, is the benefit to the community or the individual going to put a burden on the community or a burden on any of the adjacent landowners and people who've already got a vested or had a vested interest in their property and developed it based on their understanding that the current zoning and the current character of the land was why they invested into that area. We see that a lot, especially in rural communities where people say, hey, I moved out of the city to live in the county because I don't want to live in a subdivision, or I don't want to live in a urban environment. And now all of a sudden, my neighbor's gotten approved for a zoning to build 50 houses next to my farm. And how did that happen? And so that's the kind of things we have to look at and try to find a balance. And I mean, that's all it is. It's just trying to find that balance, like you mentioned earlier, because there's reasonable regulation with that rational nexus, and then there's overbearing regulation that is just arbitrary and non-productive per se. And that also affects your economic development potential, because if you get a bad reputation of being either a yes man, where it's kind of like the Wild West, that makes people, I think, a little bit wary to invest in your community, because the stability of it and the sustainability over time will eventually become a problem. And then there's the side where you're so heavily regulated and you're the no guy that always turns everything down because it doesn't fit the mold perfectly. And there's somewhere in the middle where you find a reasonable, many times, if you take the time, you can find some way to make things work. My goal is always not to be able to say no, or not to just say yes on a blanket statement, but to figure out a way to say, yes, this is possible if this is done and if that is done. And we just have to find a way to make it work in those ways. Sometimes it works that way and sometimes it doesn't, because at the end of the day, codes are one thing and enforcement is another thing. And if you only have so many bodies and sets of eyes and ears that can do code enforcement, then you're spread pretty thin on how you can enforce that code long term. So we have to be careful with a lot of compromising type things, because remembering slight details about some limitation that was placed on a property 15 or 20 years later is just not reasonable. So we have to figure out some way to make that work administratively also. But the goal is always to come to a compromise.
So, yeah, I'm very interested in hearing about how to, like you said, you say yes, if, and making things work. So just to kind of shift the conversation to Dalton Whitfield specifically, you said the regional commission is not so much here's what to do, but maybe suggestions and that sort of thing. And so when you're asking those questions like, how can we help? What do you need? I don't know how much you can get into this, but what kind of feedback are you getting with those types of questions?
Specific to Dalton Whitfield?
Mm-hmm.
What we see here a lot of is obviously economic development. it's very much driven in industry and industrial expansion, specifically industrial diversification and training. So, a couple of metrics that are based on, and I'm sure, there's better people to talk about that. So I won't go too far in the rabbit hole of economic development because there's some great folks that do economic
We had
development.
Carl Campbell on.
Carl Campbell.
Yeah, he was
Carl's
our
the
second
man.
episode.
Carl's the man. So he knows all that stuff. And I'm sure he talked to y'all about, you need an educated or a trained, skilled workforce, as they call it, and to be able to attract those higher paid, more diverse, and long-term sustainable investments that are going to provide those well-paid jobs and that are going to be an investor in your community for, decades, rather than just come in with a tax abatement, stay for 10 years, make some, low earning jobs, and then flee after your tax abatement plan runs out. We've all seen that happen. So, that's one of the things is we work with Carl and folks like that at the Economic Development Department, or the Economic Development divisions of every local government. So some have an economic development person, some have a joint development authority where it may be several counties that pool together and have one Carl for 2 or 3 counties. Mm-hmm. So it just depends on where you're at and how that works. So we help them a lot when they reach out and say, we've got a prospect that could come to town, could be a big deal, it's going to be a huge impact, positive impact on the community, but we need we need a little sewer extension, or we need stormwater issues fixed. We need to do some stuff on our end in order to get this property to the point to where it makes sense for them to invest here in our community. And it also may be that little difference of them investing in our community, they may be in competition with another community somewhere else. Oftentimes they are. They've usually got a list of communities and they're going to work out, obviously, the most equitable deal for that business. Mm-hmm. And one of the programs that we have out there is called One Georgia and One Georgia Edge. And One Georgia Edge is intended to be able to give a little additional incentive in the event that a large developer is looking at developing outside the state, and we can bring them back. So we have an economic development staff. We've got 2 staff persons that staff that full time, and that's what they do. They, when people like Carl reach out to them, or just other cities and counties, and they need things and help with grant identification, grant writing, because these state and federal grants are extraordinarily cumbersome, and so they know that process inside and out, and they work with them through that process. That's one of the things we see here in Whitfield County, obviously, is that industrial growth and diversification, and getting away from just the flooring and just the construction and real estate based economy, and getting more into that diverse economy where you have different types of industries that would create that more sustainable economy, so that we don't have another 2008 event where, we suffer one of the most highest levels of unemployment in the entire nation. We want to make sure that that does not happen again. So that has been one of the biggest things that we've worked with them on, with strategies there. The other side of that is community development, because it's as much part of industrial development as infrastructure and sewer in today's modern manufacturing era, or not just manufacturing, but in industrial era, because there's a lot of technological based industry out there now that doesn't require tons of water and sewer, but it requires highly skilled people and environments that those people want to live in. And so that's what some companies are looking for, is what kind of qualities does the community have for our executives or for our talent, because we want to build where they're going to be happy and that they're going to stay employed in our company so we can retain that talent. They want to see community assets and things like that. And so we're working obviously on different grants and projects to, there's been a number of parks built in Whitfield County. I don't know if y'all have paid attention over the last couple of years, but when you want to look at the number of acres in parks that have been built and developed in Whitfield County and in the city of Dalton, Varnell, Cahutta, everybody's made investments in this and these community assets. And I mean, when you think of Rocky Face Ridge, the park that they've just finished over there, I mean, you got 1,000-acre park that's got the historical significance with the Civil War for history buffs, but you've also got all the miles of trails that they're going to have on that, and this huge asset. And today that may not seem like the biggest deal in the world because we're kind of spoiled in the sense that there's so many places you can go around to hike and things like that, we kind of take that for granted. But one day there's going to be a lot more developed property in this community, and having a 1,000-acre park is going to be a huge asset because not very many counties or cities, especially in this region, can say that they have their own local 1,000-acre passive recreation park.
Mm-hmm.
You got Hag Mill, huge win for Dalton to have a recreational park like that with the reservoir, and just countless others. Prater's Mill just got I think a 60-acre donation of land, so now they're expanding their footprint. So you got that, and then of course Burr Park. So we talk about passive and recreation. You got Burr Park, so you got the community side of it, the community center and the downtown, and all this downtown development. And we've been very much involved in trying to help assist in those type of things, from the historical renovations. We were able to work with Barrett Properties early on when they were working on the Belt Gallant building. We were in some of those very initial conversations and helped identify the tax credit program that the federal government uses for historical renovation or restoring historic properties. And when we identified that money, that was one of the windfalls to making that project work, because it helped make the numbers work for that development. And so it was really cool to see that from beginning to end and be able to lead people in the right direction. So it's a lot about community development too, and the Burr Park was a great example of that. Now, granted, that was a private endowment and very much part of the chamber, and of course the Northwest Georgia Community Foundation is part of that, managing that development. But being a part of those things and identifying the needs and creating the community assets so that you're creating a better life and quality of life for the people who already live here, but you're also creating a much more attractive and appealing environment for those target professionals or those target industries. Because sometimes it comes down to when you're a global company and you have a choice of going anywhere, you have that choice. And so you've got, if you want to have a chance at getting some of that talent or getting some of that investment of that scale, you have to have the assets that attract those types of investors. And so that's where a lot of the strategy is in working on some of that community development. And that's why when we say economic development, a lot of times we say community and economic development, because they're tied together at the hip. And it all kind of works together to achieve that same goal again, which is sustainability. At the end of the day, it's creating a robust economy and a higher quality of life, but particularly in such a way that's sustainable. And there's a project, I mentioned downtown Dalton, that's been a huge focus for even before I started my job. It was very early on, and I remember right before I started my job, I was going to Dalton State College. So I was in Dalton all the time, especially around downtown, because we had a few restaurants and a few things downtown and would be there occasionally. And I remember, just the number of empty storefronts, places were in terrible shape. Fraker's, Peacock Alley, I think it was at that time, burnt down. It stayed empty for a long time. And it was just really kind of like, wow, there's so much potential here, but there just hasn't been that investment yet. And then now, you look at it today, no, we're not a downtown Chattanooga, and we probably never will be, because that's just an entirely different environment. But we've got Dalton's downtown back. Downtown is now, again, for the first time since, the 60s, the place to be. And you can see that you're getting just tons of investment. There's new businesses opening up. The buildings they just continue to keep getting redeveloped in a quality way, not just, people slapping things back together, but really investing into quality redevelopment. And so now that's created that sense of community again. And now not only do people want to build businesses in downtown for the first time in a long time, I don't know if it was ever really a thing back in the day, but people want to live downtown, right in the heart of downtown. They want to live above the restaurants and bars. They want to live, within a 5-minute walk from downtown.
We have a client right now that is specifically asking for that. I want to be within 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Don't want to have to Uber from the bar.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and with the summer concert series and all that, I mean, it's a cool place to be for a lot of people. And a lot of people, have said, now what are we on the Generation Z or something like that? Or that's like the people that are up and coming, and professionals. But millennials have been the biggest conversation for the longest time, like me and Corey. And a lot of people were saying, 7 or 10 years ago, like, well, millennials don't want to, buy a house in the suburbs by and large, and live at a cul-de-sac. They want to be, like the show Friends or things that we watch, Seinfeld, where you kind of, you live in more of a community environment in town. And in a lot of cases that's true. I think I think there's enough of that it's created a big drive for that kind of development. And we see that here even in Dalton, because there's been, I don't know how many, I don't have a number in my head of how many lofts we have in Dalton now that are full-time residential, long-term apartment lofts. But, we've got quite a few downtown. Now the Belt Gallant building that I mentioned earlier, this is the first basically residential purpose built development that we've had downtown. And there's more to come. That's a big driving force in downtown development now, because we've got the businesses, we've got the restaurants, we've got that kind of growth happening. But the true sustainability to a downtown is people. You need to have people that don't have to leave their house and drive 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to come to downtown. You need people that live within walking distance of downtown, that need to that benefit from buying their groceries near downtown, and benefit from, frequenting restaurants and things and stores to buy what they need.
Sure.
And to recreate. So the goal there is you can't get enough people in the lofts in the building in Dalton. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to give up your ground level retail to be 100% residential in every building downtown. You have to be very careful how you balance that, because if you go the other way and you make everything residential and you don't have any, it creates the whole same imbalance. So identifying properties that are suitable for multifamily development to get quality housing in the downtown center is a big initiative, and that's something that we've worked on in planning with them for several years, and trying to be a part of those conversations and seeing something come to fruition there, so to create that economic sustainability.
Corey, I know you got like 30 more questions on that sheet, so we're going to have a part 2 of Ethan.
Fair.
We do have to hit on this episode, though, before we go into all those other questions. So we're going to bring you back for those. We got to figure out some more of this affordable housing situation.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go.
Yeah, so like tiny houses, that's part of the conversation. But one of the things I hear often from people in our community is all of this high-tech industry is great. All of this manufacturing and diversification of our industry, all that's wonderful. At our core, we are still a manufacturing town, and there are people who drive heisters and work on krill racks and do maintenance on these coaters. We have to figure out where they can live, and Corey and I see it every day in that homes that we used to be able to rent out for $500 or $600 a month are now $1,500 or $1,600 a month, and so we now are causing, back to your comment about code enforcement, we are now causing multi-generational to live in housing that's not designed for it, and people are living with their aunt or whoever they can just to make ends meet. So is there a plan, or maybe that's not even the right question, how can we put affordable housing back into our community in a smart, respectful, and appropriate way?
That's a great question. And like one of my favorite college professors used to say with questions, it depends. And so,
it depends is not a fair answer.
Yeah.
That answer.
So, but no, I'm gonna do my best to try to take a stab at that. So okay. You're absolutely right. I mean, affordable housing, I mentioned earlier, I think the thing that I keep trying to throw out there is sustainability. And sustainability is not about having one of anything. It's about having a good blend of diversity, particularly in this case, housing diversity. Your housing economy doesn't need to be, it's not going to be a healthy housing economy truly for your community if it's all skewed in one direction, either low income, that doesn't make for a healthy community, or if it's all extraordinarily high income, doesn't necessarily make for what you would call, in most cases, a healthy community. And, unless you live on, what is it, Long Island or somewhere like that now, or not Long Island, but the Hamptons or something like that, to where, obviously there's enough return on investment there with their taxes that they can make it pretty nice. But for most of our communities like Northwest Georgia, you need a good blend, because you're right, our economies, one way or another, no matter how diverse, there's always going to be those jobs that are service-related jobs. Like I mentioned for like Gilmer County earlier for tourism, you need to have opportunity for those people who have service-type jobs or labor-type jobs to have a place to stay. Particularly,
planning folks call it workforce housing.
Workforce housing. That's right. And particularly, you want to have that in a reasonable proximity to your centers of employment. And that comes back to zoning and making sure that your centers of employment are not just littered, like a Dalmatian across your community. You want to have those in more concentrated areas. Mm-hmm. And, when you talk about affordable housing today, I think what that really means is high density housing. I think is really what we've come to understand that as, because single family housing development, you can get fairly affordable with that. I don't know about today's market. I mean, it's really started to increase. $250,000 is not what $250,000 was even, I think, 5 years ago with housing for what we're seeing our developers building. Mm-hmm. So I think in a lot of ways, it's going to be a density issue, and density, you're limited on where density can go because the health department tells you where density can go. You've got to have sewer. And if you're going to have sewer, you got to have the transportation. So you got to make sure that your roads and things can support high density development, that you're not going to cause, public safety issues by sticking an apartment or 10 apartments in one particular corridor. I think if you want to talk about multifamily in a high concentration, if y'all ever drive around College Drive at Tibbs Road through that little area, more apartments than anywhere else probably in the city in one location. And when you're out there, when it's quitting time or staff changes, then it's crazy with what the traffic happens. So when you're talking about multifamily developments, you got to figure out where it's going to go, and you got to plan for that. And that really, in this case with Dalton being the way it is, we have one of the most impressive and capable utilities that there is. Dalton Utilities is incredible in their capability to serve capacity, where it be residential or industrial, and in a number of ways. And so as long as you're within the city of Dalton, chances are pretty darn good that infrastructure when it comes to utilities is not going to be an issue. But when we start talking about ways to handle density, we have to, again, be respectful of those other communities that are established. So your single family neighborhoods, being respectful of those folks that, again, they made their investment because they didn't want to live in an apartment complex. So we have to be careful how we mix those things together. And I think in classical type, what they call Euclidean zoning, now there's a lot of other ways to look at it, because there's a lot of studies out there now that they're saying, well, it makes better sense to actually mix densities. And I'll give you a perfect example. I don't know that I would consider it affordable housing per se, but it meets what we consider to be a healthy mix of density, and it's going to be their whole plan for their little development. And that's the Patterson Farm. I'm sure you guys know over on Cleveland Highway.
Haven't heard of it. Don't know anything.
Yeah, no, there haven't been any articles or anything on that lately. No, that development and the people that put that together had this great idea that they wanted to build a community. So they didn't want to just build a your regular run-of-the-mill cul-de-sac development. Not there's anything wrong with that. It works great. A lot of developers do that and have had great success with it. But they wanted to do something different, and they wanted to build more of a community. And a community, again, is a blend of density of housing types. And of course, there's a commercial center that was designed into that whole development that is going to be integral in its long-term I think, vitality in having all of that right there, because you basically, in a development like that, you're building almost its own little town. And that's going to be within the city of Arnell, but that Patterson Farm is going to be like its own little village. And it's that blend of housing. So there's this concept. And one of the ways, and the way that we handle that zoning wise, is that when you have a development like that, that's all inclusive, we call it a planned unit development. A PUD is what most people would call that. And so that creates an opportunity to do unique things that you could not do in your typical single family, multifamily, commercial, residential, all that stuff. So we do have the opportunity to do that here. But, there's a lot of conversations nationally right now in the planning sector as far as the old idea of Euclidean zoning, which is you do not mix high density and low density development. You transition from high density to low density, and you don't put the two necessarily. You don't put high density departments next to 3-story, 3,000 square foot houses. That's just not good development. Mm-hmm. That's the way Euclidean zoning works and the principle it was based on. But now you have more ideas that are saying, well, when you look at old cities and you look at some of the most steady and sustained development in the country, you can think of like the city of Savannah. You've got mansions and apartments and retail all together. And that has been still some of the highest maintained real estate values in the state. And it's the oldest city, from the 1700s, it's still laid out the same way. And it's all mixed together. And so that's where that sort of theory comes from of, that's your community. Because as people are together, as far as when you live in the neighborhood together and you see people, that creates that connection between the obviously the well-to-do and the folks that work the service jobs and things like that. So when they're commuting in a community together, it brings them closer together versus separating them apart and creating that whole, I think we all know, the good side, the right side, or the wrong side of the tracks type mentality. Right. Is you're blending those different housing types together, and that workforce housing being a part of that. Now, like I say, there's potential to do that sort of thing, but it's all a matter of making sure that it fits in the area that it's in, that it's not going to create a larger issue than what it's going to solve. And with affordable housing, like I said, it's a density issue. You've got to have the density in order to drive the prices down enough to be competitive. Because I mean, y'all know, to build a development right now is a historical high. Right. I don't know how you can build an affordable house right now of any size, even a tiny house. I mean, you try to build a tiny house.
Good segue. I was coming to it. Tell me about tiny houses or mobile homes or tiny house park, mobile home park in Whitfield County. How do we make that happen? Or can we?
Well, right now, I don't think it's possible. I don't think that they have the right building code to support that. And that's been the biggest sticking point, because we actually, in Whitfield County, we have some zone districts that do not have a minimum square footage. However, we have the International Building Code that the building inspectors use. Mm-hmm. And in that building code, it tells you basically basic sizes of, you got to have so many rooms of this size. Your ceiling height has to be a certain way. If you build stairs, they have to be built a certain way. And when you look at a tiny house,
it doesn't fit any of those.
It does not fit any of those, right? So that was the big thing with tiny houses. And this was nationwide. And so the tiny house thing, thanks HGTV for putting that out there. And, we got this huge wave of everybody wants a tiny house, and people, are blowing the phones up. We don't get it as much now as we were, say, 3 or 4 years ago.
It seems to died off a little bit.
4 years ago.
A little less trendy.
Man, 4 years ago, it was, I swear I was about to pull my hair out with tiny houses, because it was just, everybody was all about tiny houses. But there were two issues with a lot of the cases with tiny houses. One was the building code. Mm-hmm. There just was not a building code that you could go by. The only way that you could make that work, and it was all in the hands of the building inspector, was whether or not they would let you get an engineer or an architect design your tiny house and sign off on it for liability. Meaning that if that house caught fire or whatever happened, and someone was killed, for instance, or injured, that would not fall back on the city or county, because they approved it, they permitted it, right? So it's supposed to be safe housing, but it didn't meet any of the IBC code. So you've illegally permitted a house, and now someone has been killed as a result of that. It's a huge liability. So in some cases, they would let an architect or an engineer sign off on that. They would hold the burden of liability, and it would allow that person to have that tiny home. But now we're not talking about affordable housing, right? We're talking about hiring an architect. We're talking about hiring a custom builder
Right.
who's not going to be a home builder. So they're going to charge per square foot probably tenfold
Mhm.
what your standard home builder is going to build. So 4 or 5 years ago, when we talked about tiny houses, people talked about, well, I think it's a good affordable option. I could say, no, it's absolutely not at that time, because I could say you could build 1,000 square foot house cheaper than you could build a tiny home, and you could get it permitted and built faster.
Right.
You know, so things have changed, and people found ways to deal with that. So tiny houses also have another unique thing about them. When you think about you said mobile home a minute ago. Interesting thing there. This is one of those little details. If I'm ever on Jeopardy or one of those random factoids, there's a term a mobile home and a manufactured home, and I believe it's 1976 was the Manufactured Housing Act, and that's of course separating those two things, and that's when they came up with a set of standards and said, okay, mobile homes are great, and that's a great affordable option, or manufactured homes. But we have to have this set of standards. And that's when they created that act, and it set forth sort of like building regulations, but for mobile housing, housing on chassis. And so now they have to, every one of those has a placard that says this has been inspected and found to meet the
Housing and Urban
requirements.
Development guidelines.
Exactly, HUD guidelines. And, then it's permittable. And then you can take that into any community in the country and should be able to find a place to put that house. And that comes into the Fair Housing Act. So, you've always got to have a place to accommodate manufactured housing in your community, or you should, because otherwise you stand at, and I'm not a lawyer, I've got a bow tie on, but I'm not a lawyer, never went to law school, so I can't give legal advice. But many lawyers have echoed that when you prohibit things like a mobile or manufactured house, or manufactured home, because it is permitted, it is a safe dwelling. When you don't allow that, you're in violation of the Fair Housing Act, because now you're making housing less affordable and less obtainable in your community. You are creating that divide. So, but that is a manufactured home, and they have that set of standards. And a tiny house could not meet those standards either, because again, they're even smaller than a single wide manufactured home. So that wasn't a way to permit them. Even RVs and campers, they have to pass some sort of a safety inspection and have characteristics that get them approved and permitted. But
we don't have a zoning code in Whitfield County for that either, right? We can't live in an RV.
You cannot live in an RV permanently, not in Whitfield County. And most of our region, well, pretty much all of it is that way. Now, there are some cases to where you can live in an RV or a camper temporarily, provided that you are in the process in making a due diligent effort to build a home, a permanent dwelling. Then you can use that in some cases. I can't remember right off the top of my head. I can't quote for Whitfield County if we have that specific option, but in a number of communities, that is an option, but it is tied to a permit. So when that clock goes up on that permit, if you're still in that camper or RV, you're going to get a knock on your door, and they're going to say, okay, what's the deal? Are we finished yet? Are you guys, have you made an effort? Because some people will say, oh, sure, yeah, we're going to build a house.
I nailed that 2x8 up last week. Yeah, we're good.
And then 3 years later, they're like, well, you guys haven't even laid a foundation yet. So we're not really sure you guys ever intended to actually build a house. So you have to make sure that there's something to deal with that. And the reason that is, and the reason we have to look at it that way is because when you start talking about campers and RVs, a lot of times we're not talking about septic systems. And so you've got a public health issue, health potential issue there. And those types of housing, I'm sure, if you make the great ultimatum that, if you're going to be homeless or live in a camper, which would you choose? Obviously we choose the camper, but they're just not designed to live in 365 days a year for decades on end.
That's right.
They're poorly insulated, so your utility costs are going to be much higher. And, there's just a number of issues, and usually septic systems are one of those. So that's something that we have to consider with them. And also you got to be careful, economics kind of come into play. I mean, if y'all are doing comparable property, you're trying to sell a house, if you've got a nice house that would be, $300,000, but 3 out of 4 neighbors live in campers that you can see from the front porch of this house, you're probably going to have a hard time
I'd
selling
like to
it,
pull
right?
those comps.
Yeah, you're probably going to have a hard time selling that house for what it should go for. So you have basically put in a burden. You have depreciated the value of that house by allowing substandard development.
Right.
So we have to look at it that way. Tiny houses, until I think it was 2018. The last few years have kind of been a little bit of a blur with COVID and everything. But I'm thinking it was 2018. They did pass a potential or an optional amendment, an appendix to the International Building Code called Appendix Q. And Appendix Q basically lists out the specifics and the design features that you need to have as part of a tiny home, quote unquote. So it talks about, points of egress. So for instance, in a fire, you need to have an operable window, because most of those things have those little lofts that are like the ceiling height is 3 feet in the loft. And so, fire is a big concern there, because if you've only got one way in and one way out and you're, hugged against the ceiling, you've got smoke issues, and how are you going to get out? So, they want to make sure that there's opportunity for that to be safe and for you to have a chance to get out of that in the event of a fire. And of course, there's things like the steps and the railings. There's little features here and there to make sure that they're structurally sound, that they are, of course, insulated, and that they're going to be efficient as far as utilities go, because that's a big part, of course, of affordable housing. You can live in affordable housing and pay 3 times what I pay to heat and cool my house, because whoever built your house or designed your home didn't insulate it properly and things like that. We hear about that type of thing all the time. So, they want to make sure that it's a quality product and that it's a safe product. And that's what Appendix Q is intended to do. Now, it hasn't been out for that long, so we don't know what the long-term impact of that's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want a tiny house now, I can go to Appendix Q and build it that way. And
if your local government that you're going to build in or buy in has adopted Appendix Q, because it is an optional appendix. It doesn't have to be a part of the IBC, because, again, it is still in what you would call a new phase. They're allowing it as an option now, but that's something that you can hang your hat on as a building inspector and now say, well, it's possible to adopt that Appendix Q, and it is possible to be able to permit a tiny house if the local government takes the initiative to do so. But there's another issue with tiny houses. When you talk about housing and you're talking about density, again, I mentioned density generally belongs in an urban environment, or at least in a municipality where you have water, sewer, and infrastructure that supports density. Because one of the issues that a lot of people with tiny houses want is they want smaller overhead. One of the whole principles, as I've always understood it with tiny housing, is empty nesters that don't want to mow the lawn, don't want to have this big house to take care of and clean. We really want to downsize. That's the whole the minimalistic approach to life. Or it's the millennial or the new generation that has that whole inherent approach, because we went through the whole debacle of 2008, and people see, used to houses and homes and real estate, that was your biggest investment in life. And it was an investment that was going to appreciate. And so I think that whole concept of some of us that grew up and lived through the recession, it created a lot of apprehension with going into 30 years of debt versus how can we downsize that, and how can we just have less stuff? Because, when we think about like our parents or grandparents and stuff, and what's the most popular thing to build that I see all over the place? Storage warehouses. Everybody loves their stuff. They get more stuff than they've got place to put it. You rent a warehouse and you put your stuff in there. And so that's that minimalistic ideology of, I want to downsize. I want to have less stuff and less to worry about, so that I can go about living my life. I can travel. I can, do whatever it is that you do, and not have that overwhelming umbrella of burden that is owning a house and a larger property. Me, on the other, I'm like the anti-millennial. Like, I want 100 acres and, all that kind of stuff. But that's just, there's a lot of people that have driven that desire. And so that whole tiny house thing just falls right into that. So it's small overhead. But it still has this super high quality, which has been this whole, I think, the hipster movement. It's like we want less, but we want the best. So we want like every design feature is something unique. And so that's a lot of the tiny housing that I've seen so far has been less focused on affordable housing and more focused on that idea of it's more affordable than a larger estate, but it does require a lot because usually, again, it's a fully custom job. I do a lot of building myself, and I can tell you that to build a tiny home, and you have to come up with a way to use every single square foot of that house, because when you're talking about 400 to 500 square feet for 2 or 3 people, I mean, that's insane to think about. All your belongings, all your food, everything has to be in that house somewhere. And so they come up with some crazy killer and incredible things to solve those issues. But each one of those things takes hours, or it takes you buying a special product that somebody makes. And all that means you're paying a lot more money, unless, you get yourself some tools and you decide you're going to learn how to build your own house and you build your own tiny house. You could get into it pretty affordable in that way. But the more we see of that kind of stuff, the more people are building them, the more demand goes up, then it's going to change the market, and people are going to start manufacturing tiny houses on a more of a manufacturing process, which will drive that cost down. But when it comes to tiny housing, you have to have a lot that can support a septic system when you're in the county a lot of times, because you're not going to have sewer. And if you don't have sewer, then you're relying on the health department to tell you how big your property has to be. So while you may have a 500 square foot house and have your overhead pretty low on that, you may have to have 3/4 of an acre of land to support a septic system for that house.
Right.
And so that creates a whole nother issue. So now you got to figure, well, tiny houses are going to have to go in sewer served areas. And so now you have to figure out where those areas are and where can you put a tiny house or a tiny house community that's not going to create an issue for an existing housing development. And guys, we've got some houses that are pretty darn small in Dalton. There was one built recently. We have a zone district called 0 lot line residential. And basically you can scoot at single family only, which, I mean, tiny houses are technically single family detached dwellings. That's not multifamily. It's just high density single family. And, we have a zone in Whitfield County and Dalton that's called 0 lot line residential, and that allows you to build on an extremely small footprint, but that requires you to be on sewer. So that cannot even happen if you're not on sewer at all. And it wouldn't make any sense to, because the whole idea is lot density. And so it's just building smaller houses on smaller lots with way less setbacks. So your lawn in a 0 lot line, it's not true 0 lot line like downtown where they're actually touching, but we're talking, 14 or 15 feet between each house, which is really close by most standards. So we've got some pretty small housing or some pretty high density housing, but the what would fall into the definition of a tiny house, we do not have yet. And I've not been made aware that Whitfield County has adopted that Appendix Q that would allow the building of or the permitting of a tiny house. But one of the ways people have gotten around that is if you don't need to get a building permit unless you're building a foundation or getting a permanent power source. So what a lot of people with tiny housing have done is they really treat it more like an RV. They built their own RV. They go out and they buy a trailer with a chassis and an axle, and they build their tiny house on that. They hook it behind their truck, and they go, stay at our RV parks and things like that.
Yeah.
And of course, that's perfectly legal and perfectly acceptable. But you see a lot of tiny houses on trailers, and that's why you can't get a building permit to build them in most places, to build it on a permanent foundation, but they can build them on a trailer.
Sneaky. Well, Ethan, I think this is a good stopping point for us. I know you got other stuff to do, and although I do have plenty of other stuff that I wish that we had time to talk about, we'll definitely want to bring you back if that's cool with you.
Be glad to.
But I definitely appreciate you coming in and talk with us. I think this has been one of the more informative episodes that we have done. Michael, you got anything you want to throw in?
Just going to say, if somebody wants to talk to you about developing something, or if somebody wants to reach out to you and have a question directly for you, how do they get you?
They can reach me at the Regional Commission. We have a receptionist. They can just call us there. It's 706-295-6485. Or we have our office here in Dalton. We actually have two different numbers. They both pipe into the same office, and they can call that first number, or they can call 706-272-2300, and the receptionist will get them to me. But I will say, if you're a local person and you're looking into developing your property, the person that is absolutely most qualified to answer that.
I know the answer. It's
is
Gene Garland.
Gene Garland with the zoning department is going to be your first step. Now, I can help you and answer most all those questions, but she is the most savvy person on that, because it'll take me a second to look up an answer, but she's going to know
Truth
right
be
on top
told,
of
I
her
asked
head.
Gene to be on this podcast, and Gene said, "You know who would be really good for that? You really ought to talk to Ethan. That's the guy."
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
I could
definitely.
ask 1,000 more questions, so thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And Carl, you didn't get any screen time, so shout out your camera. There it is.
Sounds good.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Ethan.
Thank you all.